So, it's finally time to talk about Spider-Man 3. I can mostly guarantee you that this is kinda gonna be a lengthy video, well, depending on the running time when I'm done with it, as I will definitely be sharing a lot of information and thoughts about the movie throughout the video. I will also be sharing a lot of deleted scenes from the movie that will hopefully garner your interest. So this means I'm going to have to cut this intro a little shorter compared to the previous two videos. Before I start, I just want to say check out the previous two Spider-Man videos I made if you haven't already. You don't have to check them out before this one, but I recommend watching them as well if you like this video. So enough talking, let's just get this video started. Only a couple months before Spider-Man 2 was released, Spider-Man 3 was already in production. Sony Pictures brought back Alvin Sargent from the second movie to write the script of this movie, with the additional option to write a fourth movie, which, spoiler alert, never happened unfortunately. After Spider-Man 2's release, they also brought in Ivan Raimi, Sam Raimi's brother, to write a treatment for the film in only a couple months. Sam Raimi wanted to explore Peter Parker discovering that the criminals he sees could have humanity to them. Sandman was the main villain Raimi wanted, as he thought he'd be a very visually interesting villain for the movie. The version of Sandman in this movie that the screenwriters made had him with the, of course, controversial background of him being the true killer of Uncle Ben. They wrote Sandman this way to add more guilt onto Peter for the death of his uncle. Raimi also wanted the Vulture to appear in the movie as a villain, who also had Ben Kingsley set to play the role. As has been said many times before, Sam Raimi originally didn't want Venom in the movie due to his characteristic of lacking humanity, though that didn't stop producer Avi Arad and Marvel Studios CEO into having him include Venom due to fan demand. The executives did this because they thought Raimi should slow down on focusing on the Spider-Man villains he likes so much, instead start giving what the fans were asking for. The inclusion of Venom in Spider-Man 3 apparently made Raimi appreciate the character a bit more over time during production. They also wanted Gwen Stacy to appear in the script to have a rival love interest for Peter. At this point, Alvin Sargent was becoming aware of how complex and jam-packed the story was getting, which tempted him into the idea of splitting the movie into two parts. This would have worked a lot better, but was ultimately dropped when Sargent couldn't really make a seamless climax for the first part. Surprisingly enough, John Dykstra did not return for the visual effects for this movie, but rather his colleague Scott Stotdyke. Why do these people have such weird last names? Anyway, the VFX artist designed a miniature set of buildings, so if there was a shot where the buildings were destroyed, they can accurately depict it in the shot instead of using CG. To accurately depict how Sandman's sand particles move in the movie through VFX, they experimented with up to 12 different types of sand, which they would launch large quantities of the sand at stuntmen. In fact, I think it's relevant to note for the scene where Spider-Man fights Sandman for the first time, they took an amputee martial artist expert Baxter Humpy to wear a Spider-Man costume for the iconic scene where Spidey punches Sandman in the chest. They would add a CG Spidey hand on the back of Thomas Hayden Church in post. This is a pretty cool and creative way to shoot this scene, and I'm sure I probably wouldn't have a better way of doing it. Both the black costume Spider-Man and Venom suits were not directly lifted from the comics, but rather just black versions of the traditional red and blue costume for Spider-Man. However, they originally did want to use the comic book suits for the movie, but that was scrapped for reasons that I will not vocally mention, but I actually really like the changes that they went with these costumes. I think it gives the costumes a bit more to look at than the comic book ones, as I don't think the comic book ones would have worked that well for this movie. As I explained in my Spider-Man 2 video, Danny Elfman dropped out of Spider-Man 3 due to conflicts with Raimi with Spider-Man 2's score, saying he had a miserable experience working with Raimi during the production of Spider-Man 2's score. As it turns out, he apparently did do some work for Spider-Man 3, as producer Grant Curtis said in a Q&A that Elfman and Christopher Young, the main composer of Spider-Man 3, had apparently been working with each other during the production of the score. There is also a version of the theme where Peter and MJ get back with each other at the ending of the movie that is supposedly composed by Danny Elfman himself. I will leave a link to the exact track in the description of this video if you're interested in hearing it. Anyway, Christopher Young took Danny Elfman's place after composing additional music for the second movie. He brought back Elfman's themes for Spider-Man, Peter Parker, the Green Goblin, Aunt May, and MJ. He of course composed a bunch of new themes as well, such as the one for the black costume Spider-Man, the Sandman, Venom, and a whole new motif for MJ, which occasionally plays throughout the movie, but most of the tracks that featured it was pretty much scrapped. John Debney comes back to compose some additional music with composer Deborah Lurie. Debney made the music where Peter messages MJ after the truck fight between Spidey and Sandman, and Deborah Lurie actually does a little bit more, but one notable example I want to bring up is that she did make the music for the opening montage. That's all I have to talk about as far as production goes, so now it's time to talk about the post-production. Spider-Man 3 was heckin' massive building up to its release. There were toys and merchandise at the wazoo, exciting trailers, and other such promotional material for the film. People really wanted to see Venom in the black suit so much when it was teased. So it's no shock that the film would end up having a total worldwide gross of nearly $900 million, beating the first two in a pulp. Though, of course, it wasn't really received nearly as good as the first two. People were upset at the screen time and general portrayal of Venom in the movie. They wanted a much bigger and buffer Venom, but instead we got more of a moderately sized Venom. I don't know. People also didn't like the portrayal of Peter Parker when he got the black suit, as he had more of a, well, flamboyant behavior. And also the general structure of the plot, having two confusing love triangles happening at once and a grand total of 3 villains running in the plot at the same time. People were putting the blame on Sam Raimi himself.
Working in that big budget arena with so much at stake, with much beloved characters that Stan Lee created, and people really hold him so dear to them that you don't want to mess up, and I messed up plenty with the third Spider-Man. So people, hated me for years. They still hate me.
They give you shit for that?
All the time. Yeah.
Why? What do they say?
We hate you.
The movie has been ragged on for years, but after a decade later, it seems people have been starting to appreciate the movie a bit more, as evidenced by a ton of videos recently talking about it. There's still people out there who say the movie's bad, but it's not as significant as it used to be. In fact, since then, people have been demanding Sony Pictures to release an extended cut to the movie, just like they did with Spider-Man 2.1. In 2017, just in time of the release of Spider-Man Homecoming, the demand of an alternate cut to Spider-Man 3 resulted in the release of an editor's cut of the movie, which was done, of course, by the film's editor, Bob Murawski. This wasn't an extended cut by all means, as it turned out to be 2 minutes shorter than the theatrical release, but rather a reconstructing of the movie's pacing, as well as the removal and addition of certain scenes. Of course, like in the previous video with Spider-Man 2.1, I will go over the editor's cut much later in this video, so stick around for that if you want. That's all I have to say about this segment. Now for the review. While the movie has a ton of entertaining, iconic, and even genuinely good moments, Spider-Man 3 has its problems. Though there's still a shit ton of things in this movie that I really like, so I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about just that. For the most part, the cast still does the best they could possibly do. Tobey Maguire still does a really good performance, and I actually really like the incredibly cheesy yet off-color behavior displayed by the evil side of Peter when he gets the symbiote. I also admire the themes of regret, and this is gonna sound very weird, but realization of wrongdoings at the latter half of the movie. Yeah, that sounded weird, but you get my point. He realizes how selfish he was, which was amplified by the symbiote, to the point where he hits his girlfriend. It's a really powerful scene when he realizes his mistakes and goes to the church tower to get rid of the black costume, since it's the one thing that's making him act this way. Kirsten Dunst is surprisingly a bit better in this movie than Spider-Man 2, as she goes through a lot in this movie to justify her being miserable, such as Getting unfairly fired from her job, constantly being ignored by Peter due to his selfish behavior, his boyfriend kissing a random girl in front of her, her best friend threatening her boyfriend's life to break up with him, and on top of all of that, being kidnapped and held hostage by two supervillains while being suspended thousands of feet in the air. Whew. She's actually pretty interesting in this movie, which is what makes the ending of this movie pretty satisfying to me. James Franco plays a bit of a goofy performance in this movie, but I still think this is the best his character has ever been. Well, minus the amnesia thing, which is just flat out lazy writing, but I think the fact the movie plays off of him hating Peter until the end where he comes to save Peter's life is what makes me like his arc so much in this movie. Rosemary Harris is still perfect in this movie. The scene where Peter tries to give her the ring back at the ending of the movie is one of the best scenes in the entire movie, if not the entire trilogy. It's about as good as the scene where she gives Peter the speech in Spider-Man 2. Peter tries to give her ring back since she hit MJ, but Aunt May still believes he can improve and fix everything he did wrong over the course of the movie. Just like her speech in the second movie, this helps Peter put on the classic red and blue suit and do what's right. Thomas Hayden Church is possibly the only Sandman I could ever possibly acknowledge. The dude looks like Flint Marko, and he even has the stocky build, cheekbones, and everything. He even has the classic green striped shirt and khaki pants from the comics. His character I find intriguing for the fact that he's a criminal who wants to use his money for good, which he uses to save his dying daughter. Now it's kinda tropey, but I think it works well enough in this movie. The scene at the ending of the movie where Flint Marko confesses to Peter I think is a powerful scene, and it's probably the only reason why I don't mind the Uncle Ben retcon too much. Topher Grace though, I think he's at the very least interesting. Though I thought his performance was very awkward and his venom wasn't that much greater. I mean, the dude made a boner joke.
Ooh, my spider sense is tingling. If you know what I'm talking about.
And let's not forget to mention the dude literally went to church to tell God to kill Peter Parker. That is just way beyond silly even for these movies. Though some positive things I do have to say is that I do like his costume and his overall presence. He does appear to be mildly intimidating to me. Gwen Stacy's only purpose is to give a reason to make Eddie Brock get to his revenge on Peter. Aside that, she's pretty forgettable. Though I think Bryce Dallas Howard pulls off a perfect Gwen Stacy look, even though I prefer Emma Stone's Gwen Stacy character-wise. I don't think I need to mention J.K. Simmons again, since you might already know my feelings about him already, so let's just move on. The fight scenes I think are the best in the trilogy, and dare I say some of the best in the entire Spider-Man franchise. They seem to go on a much larger scale than any of the previous ones. Shit just gets absolutely demolished in this movie. Walls are ripped from the sides of buildings, literal chunks of buildings are split in half, giant sand monsters that get exploded. The action is just absolutely insane in this movie. I still can't believe we went from this
Impressive!
to this. Though with great action scenes costs great CGI. Don't get me wrong, the scene where Sandman's in the test chamber has some amazing CGI that still holds up to this day. It's just the action itself I feel is downgraded on the CGI front. At times characters just look rubbery and bouncy when they're soaring through the air, and they also plastered flat images of the actors' faces on CGI models in certain moments, which leads to some horrifying results. Anyway, the music in this movie is once again great, but I feel it isn't as great as the previous two movies. Christopher Young's new themes to the movie are really damn good, but the themes he lifted from Elfman, while still pretty good, don't feel as grand as Elfman to me. I don't really know what it is. It could just be it doesn't really feel that rich to me as Elfman's themes, but it's probably not that big of a deal. John Debney composed 3 tracks as far as I know. The scene where Peter messages MJ, the scene where Peter talks to Aunt May, and the ending with Peter and MJ. Though the tracks he made for the last 2 scenes I mentioned went unused, and the scene where the track that plays when Pete talks to May is just the track from Spider-Man 1 where Peter talks to May after the graduation ceremony, just repurposed. And the ending sequence was completely rescored by Deborah Lurie, which just leaves him with only 1 track of his used in the movie, just like Spider-Man 2. Deborah Lurie did a lot more than him, but once again, a lot of her stuff went unused. Honestly, I think Lurie's music is probably some of the best in the score, even if most of it was unused. Spider-Man 3 is far from a perfect movie and it has its issues, but is there any way we could fix it? This is probably going to end up very complicated, but I have two different ways that I could fix this movie. One is more simple than the other, but I'm confident enough that they could still work. The first way I would fix it is, of course, sticking with the original idea of having it split to two movies. What I would do to this fix is saving the Venom stuff for part 2, which is, of course, Spider-Man 4. This would help eliminate the amount of villains in the movie and properly flesh out both Eddie Brock and Venom's character. Have Eddie Brock in Spider-Man 3 be the rival photographer for Peter, who keeps getting shit on by Peter throughout the movie, and have him get the symbiote by the ending. And have the entirety of Spider-Man 4 be about Eddie being Venom. Maybe give the symbiote a bit more of an explanation on how it got to Earth. There's a deleted scene that they originally wanted where John Jameson brings back the symbiote to Earth, which would have been much better than having it crash onto Earth with a meteorite. Another change I would make is to space Harry's subplot out a bit and remove the amnesia plot out entirely. Have more scenes of him being tormented by Norman and being pressured to killing Peter. Maybe have Norman's ghost possessed Harry into killing Peter if he keeps denying it, I don't know. And have Harry try to redeem himself by the end of Spider-Man 4, let's say. In my opinion, this would pace out his arc enough for it not to go too quickly as it did. Sandman's retcon would be dropped, but him stealing money to save his sick daughter would remain intact. The ending of his arc would probably end similarly to an alternate ending to the movie where Flint Marko's wife and his daughter would confront him and talk him out of it. This would also make Peter become remorseful for Flint. Now this is fix number 1. Fix number 2 would to literally reincorporate the additional hour of deleted footage from the final film. I would include the deleted scenes for this movie as the vast majority of them actually add more to the villains in this movie. There's a bit more to Harry, Flint, and Eddie Brock that was cut from the final, which resulted into the film's pacing to feel rushed. If they were going to add these scenes back in a Spider-Man 3.1, then it would be the definitive version of the movie in my opinion. Though what we got instead was around, let's say, May or June of 2017, every single Spider-Man movie up to The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was re-released on Blu-ray and for the first time ever on 4K UHD Blu-ray to coincide with the theatrical release of Spider-Man Homecoming. Within the re-release of Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy came a new cut of Spider-Man 3, which was re-edited by the film's editor. Now, I'm not sure if this is true or not, but I once heard that this cut was reworked from an early work print of the movie, which sounds logical to be honest. What this alternate cut does to the movie is move certain scenes around, reincorporate unused music from Christopher Young, and also the addition of brand new scenes. I won't go too much in depth of the first two stuff, but I will go over the new scenes. Right off the bat, we got a new scene where Peter looks into the chest that contains his black costume. This is a pretty minor addition, but I think it's kinda cool. There's a new take of the scene where Ursula tells Peter that MJ's been trying to call him, followed by Peter apologizing to Ursula for his rude behavior earlier in the movie. This scene replaces the little scene in the theatrical edition where Peter instead apologizes to Mr. Ditkovich, which is a scene I'd rather like in the original, so I don't love this change. An unused shot from the trailers where Peter looks into a suitcase that contains his black costume has been edited back into this cut. This is a very ominous scene, especially with the black costume breathing in the suitcase, so I really like this addition. Another shot that was in the trailers was a shot of the black costume Spider-Man swinging in broad daylight, which is followed by a brief moment where Peter throws his suit into the suitcase. This is another fun little scene that I'm glad they added back into the movie. The start of the second fight with Peter and Harry is drastically different, with Peter acting more quippy towards Harry rather than angry. I prefer this change mostly due to how entertaining it is, which makes a more fitting build-up to the fight itself. The deleted scene where Flint Marko's wife and daughter Penny are at the park and she sees the sandcastle is finally restored. This is an excellent scene and was a major mistake for them to remove it in the first place. The final new scene is where Harry Osborn looks at a photo photo with him, Peter, and MJ after rejecting Peter's offer to help him rescue MJ, which replaces the scene where Bernard the butler tells Harry the truth about his father's death. This is a much better scene than the final. Instead of forgiving Peter solely because of some dickhead old man waiting till the very moment to tell him the truth, he forgives Peter solely because he's his best friend, which makes his entrance to rescue Peter later on in the film much more satisfying. Those are all the new scenes. While those changes are mostly good, they come with costs. Of course, the scene with Peter apologizing to Mr. Ditkovich was replaced with him apologizing to his daughter. This change doesn't make a lot of sense to me, as Peter yelled at Mr. Ditkovich, not Ursula, so his apology to him makes more sense. Though one really bad change this cut makes is how they remove the scene where Aunt May talks to Peter in his apartment. I already said earlier that this scene is great, as she gives Peter the motivation to do what's right at the ending of the movie, so to remove it altogether just makes his return jarring to me. Like I said, there's also some minor rearrangements of certain scenes in the movie, such as the infamous Saturday Night Fever dance being pushed to after Peter and Harry have their second fight. Though they're pretty minor, so I won't touch upon those. Overall, I'd say the editor's cut is pretty much on the same level as Spider-Man 2 for me. It's a nice little addition for the trilogy, but doesn't really serve a whole lot to me. It makes some changes I like and some that I don't. Other than that, we still don't have a true extended cut of Spider-Man 3, as there's still a whole hour missing from the movie. Though, what did those hours contain? Let's break everything down in this next segment. Okay, so this segment is probably going to be much longer than the deleted scenes segment in the last video, but I'll make it as brief as I can. I primarily wanted to include this segment because I thought it would be fun to dig through all the deleted scenes and add some thoughts to them. I highly doubt I will list these in the correct order that they would have appeared in the movie, but I don't think that really matters. Anyway, the first deleted scene is a scene where Spidey saves a child hanging upside down from a tree while he's dressed up as the web slinger. This was meant to take place during the opening montage and is pretty minor, but it would have been nice for its inclusion. This next scene takes place in the novel, where instead of Harry pushing Peter to the side when he tries to grab his attention, Harry actually buys into what Peter is saying, but Norman's ghost pushes him out of it. Then Harry goes insane, hallucinating that the butler is offering him milk and gets furtherly tormented by his father. Like I said, these two scenes would have added more to Harry's character and I would have left them in. There's a scene where Peter tries to see Harry at Oscorp, but is stopped by an intern. The fight between Harry and Peter has a few unused shots, such as a shot that shows Harry's face as he's dragging Peter across a building, Harry gaining on Peter in the alleyway, a pre-visual shot of Peter obstacling through the alleyway, and a different shot of Harry reacting to the web line trap Peter set up. There was going to be a lot more to Flint Marco's arc, such as a completely scrapped character named Dr. Wallace, played by Adrian Lester, who would serve as Flint's daughter's doctor. Marco could have presumably entered through a pipe in the ceiling of Dr. Wallace's lab and threatened him to finish the cure. After meeting Peter in his apartment, there's a scene where MJ bumps into Ursula and has a small chat with her. This scene wasn't shot as far as I know, and it's only in the novelization. There's a few unfinished pre-visual shots for the crane disaster scene, and a finished one of Spidey leaping towards the ground. During the celebration scene after Spidey saves Gwen, Peter reveals his identity to a child at the party by shooting a web at his shoe in return for the kid shooting silly string at Peter. It's not important to the plot, but it is a pretty cute scene. After Sandman wreaks havoc at the parade, Spidey swings in and saves a baby in the sandstorm and sends it back to its mother. The armored car fight between Spidey and Sandman has some additional shots, such as a shot where Spidey notices sand on top of the car before entering, which also has a BTS shot in the special features, and a shot showing the guards clinging onto the web Spidey slings towards them. There's also some minor shots, such as a scene where Spidey punches Sandman in the face, which is a bit blurry since it was recorded off of a smartphone during a premiere of the film's Comic-Con trailer, and Sandman punching Spidey off the top of the car. There's this blue screen shot of Peter in the gray hoodie that he wore in the beginning of the first movie from the bloopers, which I can only presume is some sort of flashback scene. When tracking down Flint Marco, Spidey lands onto a taxi car rather than the ground like in the final. There's a small clip in the 2006 teaser trailer where it shows Spidey jumping off the taxi and some film cells containing containing a still of Spidey posing on top of it. There apparently was going to be a scene where Flint Marko goes inside of the bank and takes the money before traveling down the sewer with it. There's a minor unused shot where Spidey hits Sandman with a piece of the train track in the subway fight scene. Also, I'd like to mention that they originally planned to have Sandman only have one arm in this scene for some reason. When Peter goes to his apartment and takes off his black suit, there's a deleted scene where Peter gets jump scared by a much more monstrous version of Venom. There's actually two different versions of this scene. The version shown in the 2006 leaked trailer actually uses an unused costume for Venom that featured smaller eyes and mouth. And the version used in the Comic-Con trailer, while being very blurry of course, apparently uses the unused animatronic version of Venom from what I can make out. Also, both versions have different shots of Peter's reaction to the jump scare. There's a scene where Hoffman tries to calm Jameson down with the chimes of Serenity. A portion of this scene can be seen in the bloopers.
Mr. Jameson, remember that campaign you told me not to run?
What about it?
I ran it.
Why are you?
The chimes of
Broke my chimes!
There was going to be a scene where a spider is seen crawling on Peter's floor as he sits on his bed. He then crushes the spider, presumably resembling the fact that he's no longer a real hero and has become something far worse. There's two different shots of this scene on Sony Pictures' stock footage website. One shows Toby's foot just hovering above the spider, while the other one has Toby stomp his foot on the ground, but there's no spider. I can assume that they were going to splice these two shots together to give the illusion that he's stepping on the spider, without Toby actually killing it, of course. There was going to be a scene where Eddie Brock was supposed to visit Gwen at her house after he got fired from the Daily Bugle, only to be shooed away by her and her parents. Interestingly enough, there's a Spider-Man 3 children's book, which I also had as a kid, that features an illustration of this scene, which I find quite funny. There was going to be a scene where Eddie walks down the street on his way to the church, as well as an extended scene of him entering the church. There's an unused shot of Peter ripping off the symbiote off of his leg. I can only presume that they didn't want this shot in there because it was too revealing, but I don't know. After the cut sandcastle scene, which was added into the editor's cut, Eddie Brock was supposed to show up and talk to Flint Marko about fighting Spider-Man. This scene would have replaced the scene where he meets Flint Marko in the alleyway with the Venom costume. There's this deleted scene where Eddie confronts Peter at night. I have no idea what this scene could have been about, nor where it could have taken place in the movie, but if anything, I had to say that it's near the ending of the movie before the final fight. What I do know is that there was going to be a scene where after getting the symbiote, Eddie pays an uninvited visit to Peter's apartment while he's not around, presumably while he's taking the shower. He seems to scan his apartment and find photos he took of MJ, as well as the picture of Aunt May, which explains how much he knows about Peter in the final fight. This scene is in the novelization, but when looking around on the Sony Pictures stock footage website, I found a shot where a hand is scanning through apartment mailboxes until it stops on Peter's, so it was probably shot at one point. There was going to be a scene right before the final battle where MJ visits Harry and tells him to forgive Peter. This scene would have taken place in a much earlier version in the movie where instead of MJ being kidnapped by Venom, Gwen Stacy is. In fact, a piece of dialogue and a single shot of this scene was in the trailer, and honestly, I would have left this in.
We've all done terrible things to each other, but we have to forgive each other, or everything we ever were will mean nothing. We've all done terrible things to each other, but we have to forgive each other, or everything we ever were will mean nothing.
The final fight was going to be drastically different, as it features alternate endings for both Sandman and Venom, which I will go into more detail in a bit, as well as, instead of MJ being kidnapped, there's Gwen Stacy, and Dr. Wallace would have even made an appearance. So there's a minor unused CG shot where Spidey jumps upward through the construction site, which I can assume is Peter going to save MJ. And there's also some previs shots of Spidey trying to take down the Sandman. Venom's alternate ending would have had Peter stab Venom as he leaped towards him while he was tied up, and the symbiote would have completely devoured Eddie until he was nothing but bones. And Venom would grow much bigger bigger and attack Peter, pulling bits of his face. While this is happening, Peter would notice some metal poles that he would shoot a web line at and pull them downward. When they fall on the ground, it weakens the symbiote. I can presume Peter kills the alien life form in the same exact way he does in the final cut, only with Eddie being already dead. Sandman's alternate ending would have had him about to crush Spider-Man with his signature spiky ball hand thing, which was never included in the movie until his wife and daughter go up an elevator to talk to him. I already liked the ending to his arc that we got in the final, but I honestly think this one's pretty good too, and I would have loved to see it. Apparently Gwen Stacy was supposed to show up to Harry's funeral, which I find weird since she didn't even know Harry, but I had the assumption that maybe she wanted to talk to Peter one more time, I don't know. And finally, multiple previs shots of what appears to be a final swing for the movie, which of course ended up not having one. I'm happy with the ending that we got, but I still would have loved to see a final swing otherwise. And with that, that is most of, if not all of the deleted scenes from Spider-Man 3 that we haven't got to see yet. Overall, these scenes would have added a bit more to the pacing of the movie, as well as certain character arcs, and probably would have made a longer, but more structurally sound movie in my opinion. Now let's wrap this video, as well as the Raimi trilogy, with my thoughts. Okay, so, update. I missed a couple of shots that are kind of minor, but I should still include them anyway, because some of the ones that I already mentioned were pretty minor. But yeah, let's just go over them real quick. I'm not going to spend too much time on them, but yeah, let's just get into it. So a shot that I did miss was a shot where Peter just sits in his apartment in the dark. I have no idea where this scene could have taken place in, but it exists, I guess. There's a couple unused shots of Sandman during the experiment scene where he gets turned into sand. Once again, nothing too major, but it exists, so I gotta talk about it. Next is during the second fight with Peter and Harry, instead of Peter insulting Harry when he's like pressed up against the wall, when Peter has Harry up in the air while he's like almost about to get hit by the glider that comes by, he tells him that stuff at the moment instead of, having him pressured against the wall when he does it. It's in the novelization, there's actually a single shot of it in the leaked trailer, so. Then there's like an alternate shot of Spidey on top of the tower where he goes to get his costume removed at the church. The one in the final movie has him looking at his hands, while this one he kind of just lifts his head up. It's in the first ever teaser trailer from 2006, but I thought it was a little bit noteworthy to mention. Voice crack, sorry. Next is an unused shot of Peter and MJ during the Harry death scene. Harry death scene? That's not weird. Harry's death scene. There we go. And it's not too different, just doesn't look like they're crying. It kind of just looks like they're making just some very emotional faces. It's nothing too big, but... Oh, and there's also one last scene where when Venom approaches Peter, it shows Peter with a shocked face as the camera pans. There's a similar shot like this in the final film, but he doesn't look at nearly as shocked. Honestly, I like this take much better than the one we got. That's probably all of them. I'm not sure. There's just a ton of crap that was removed from this movie, so there could be tons more that I'm missing, but that's all the ones that I could find, so yeah, let's just move to the final segment of the video. Spider-Man 3, despite its studio meddling, still has its heart in the right place. The passion and heart of this film is still strong and apparent through its many iconic and memorable moments. I mostly agree with the criticism this film has garnered over the past decade and a half, but I don't really understand the hate for it. I personally think it still has a lot going for it and too little to hate, but that's just me. As I said, I've seen a lot of people actually starting to praise this movie much more recently, with people even saying it's the best in the trilogy. I don't necessarily stand by that, as it definitely has tons of issues not only with its story, but some actual bits of the film's quality being downgraded from Spider-Man 2. Of course, despite the film's issues, this movie is still heavily enjoyable and entertaining for me to fully care. I never really thought this movie was that bad despite its flaws, which makes me happy that people are starting to appreciate this movie a bit more nowadays. One thing I want to mention is that People have called Spider-Man 3 a franchise killer, even though that's not necessarily true. The actual reason why the trilogy ended is something I want to hold on to for another little video, exploring the cancellation and demand of Spider-Man 4 that I might have done in like a week or two. So check that out if you want. Anyway, to conclude my thoughts on the trilogy itself, I want to say that this trilogy is my favorite trilogy of all time, and will probably remain one of the most important things to my life until the end of time. I love this trilogy so much that I have like 50 different versions of it on DVD and Blu-ray, as well as a shit ton of merchandise from it as well. These movies meant a lot to me as a kid as much as they do now, and this definitely applies to many other people around the world. All three of them have their flaws, but I'd say both their flaws and their strengths are what make them special among the comic book genre. Not to mention, they had extremely huge impacts among pop culture as well. It was almost like Spidey was on top of the world when these movies came out. You could literally find anything Spider-Man related and around many shops you could visit. Whether it be toys, candy, air fresheners, bobbleheads, cigarette lighters, mugs, Pez dispensers, bedding, video games, fucking shot glasses of all things. I might be partially nostalgia blinded, and you know what? Probably. But it's impossible to take my love away from these movies. Anyway, like this video and subscribe if you like it. I plan to have more film, comic book, and other pop culture related content coming in the future, so it'd be cool if you subscribe and stick around for more content like that if you kinda like that stuff. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Well, until I have to talk about those movies.
Oh god, oh my god.